Hi, Tony DeWitt here, Missouri Appellate Attorney and a guy who likes to make the law make sense on YouTube. Today we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about the cross-examination of one of the police officers in the Scott Peterson Parkland shooting trial. So let's take a look at that now. One of the things that neurolinguists tell us is that a confused mind always says no. So when you have the burden of proof, the last thing you want in the minds of the jury is any kind of confusion. And as a result, when you are the defense attorney, the thing that you have to create is you have to create some confusion. Now, a lot of people think that cross-examination is just breaking down the other side's tale, the tale that they told on direct exam. And while there is some of that, a lot of times witnesses are much more helpful in helping the defendant tell his story. In other words, the prosecution has their theory of the case, and they have certain things that they have to get to. So the statute here provides for two different definitions of neglect of a child. And they're in the disjunctive, so you can meet either one. The first one is basically the failure to provide a child with care and services like food, clothing, shelter, that sort of thing. That's not really at issue in this case. It is the second paragraph. A caregiver's failure to make a reasonable effort. So they have to prove, first of all, that he's a caregiver. Second of all, they have to prove that he failed to make a reasonable effort to protect a child from abuse, neglect, or exploitation by another person. So obviously, abuse could certainly be being shot by a lone shooter here. Except as otherwise provided in this section, neglect of a child may be based on repeated conduct or on a single incident or omission that results in or could reasonably be expected to result in serious physical or mental injury or substantial risk of death to a child. So what they will do here is provide the single incident and the failure to protect the person from a substantial risk of death. And of course, all of these people are under the age of 18, so they fit the definition, the statutory definition of a child. So recapping, here are the elements. Peterson was a caregiver. He failed to make a reasonable effort to protect a child from abuse, and based on a single incident of omission to protect from substantial risk of serious physical injury or death. And then the defense doesn't necessarily have to disprove any particular element. All they have to do is create enough confusion about those elements that a juror goes, well, I just don't know what to think. And in the Scott Peterson case, the cross-examination of the Coral Springs officer here that we're going to take a look at in a minute is a really good example of that. So first, let's talk a little bit about the cross-examiner's demeanor here. He is very much a person who asserts that he is in control, and the witness is going to answer him with almost every question is going to be, yes, sir. He may provide some narrative, but for the most part, the questioner uses a controlled leading question that's tight, and he gets him to admit that that's the truth. Now, there are a few times when that doesn't work, but most of the time, he is the voice of control, the voice of absolute certainty when he is testifying through this police officer, because that's what's happening. The defense attorney here is testifying through the police officer. And his job here is to create confusion about where the shooter is. In other words, to set the stage that maybe it's possible that rather than being an act of cowardice, it was just gross uncertainty about where on this large campus this particular shooter was. Now, again, I'm not saying that I believe that. I am simply telling you what his job is here and what he is trying to do in this trial. So, don't shoot the messenger. No pun intended. The the main thing here is to watch his mannerisms and watch how he goes through this cross-examination.
Now, you work for Coral Springs Police Department, correct?
Yes, I do, sir.
And that is separate from Broward Sheriff's Office, correct?
Yes, it is.
You guys have completely different radio systems, correct?
Yes, we do.
And what you say into your radio, you know, wouldn't necessarily go to BSO officers, correct?
I would not know that, no.
And conversely, when BSO and any of those officers speak into their radios, that would be coming across your radio system, correct?
No, sir.
The only way that that occurs is when the radios are patched, correct?
That is correct.
Tell the jurors what you understand patching to mean.
Patching is something that's done through dispatch. I don't really have that much knowledge on it. The only thing I can tell you is usually in large multi-agency situations, they will patch the radios so everybody can hear each other.
And you expected, because this was such a major event, that like previous major events, the radios would have been patched, correct?
Yes, sir.
You later learned at some point that they were not patched, correct?
Way later.
Gotcha. Monitoring your radio is not something that they tell you in the academy is like optional, correct?
No.
You're supposed to constantly monitor your radio because you'll be held accountable for whatever dispatch is saying, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what fellow officers are saying as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
And especially when you're reporting to the scene of an active shooting, you're going to pay particularly close attention to your radio, correct?
Yes, sir.
Because you're getting real-time intelligence that could be critical to your life when you're showing up at a scene, correct?
Yes, sir.
So what he's doing here is he's setting up the idea that basically Scott Peterson didn't hear the Coral Springs people, and the Coral Springs people didn't hear Scott Peterson, and because of that, there was just a whole lot of confusion. And the subtext here is, well, you know, if none of you guys were communicating, it's not unreasonable for my client not to know what's going on. That may or may not be a reasonable inference from the evidence, but that's where he's going with this. And he's doing a pretty good job of it. And did you notice what I said about his demeanor? Firm questions, clearly in control, question after question, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, yes sir.
When dispatch tells you, we need to get these radios patched with BSO. You heard that, right?
Subject to hearsay as well, huh?
Yeah, that's the thing.
Did you or did you not hear dispatch inform you that the radios needed to be patched with BSO?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Yeah, that's the thing. Mr. Agash, what you're reading from is not in evidence. So you can ask this witness direct questions, but I can't have you reading to the jury items that are not in evidence. Go ahead.
Did you ever hear anyone inform you that we're like working two separate operations unless the radios get patched?
Objection, same objection, Your Honor.
That is sustained.
Did you believe if the radios were not patched that you would be working like two separate investigations?
That thought never crossed my mind, sir.
In every cross-examination, you wind up drawing objections to something, and that's sort of an indication as to how you know whether or not you're hitting the nail on the head or not. And that's exactly what happens here. He's getting a little too close to things that make the prosecution a bit uncomfortable, so they start objecting. Now, what's interesting here is that he basically repeats the same question 4 different ways and finally gets him to answer it, and the answer does not wind up helping him. And what is really funny about it is that when you object, as the prosecution did, and he's reading from a transcript that's not in evidence, but it's clearly the transcript of the radio operations that day, yeah, the jury hears the question, they hear the objection, and they wonder, well, why doesn't the state want us to hear that information? Again, sometimes you ask questions that you know are objectionable just to draw the objection so that you can, you know, sort of with a wink and a nod send the jury a message, hey, there's something the state's not telling you. And I think that's perhaps what he's doing. This guy is very good at what he's doing, and he is somebody that a young lawyer could learn from.
So you're not making routine inspections on these kids to ensure that they're not suffering abuse from somewhere, correct?
That's correct.
That's not your job, correct?
I'm sorry, repeat the question.
That's not your job, correct? to ensure that every kid on that campus isn't facing possible abuse somewhere, correct?
If they are facing abuse, I would investigate it.
But of course, but you don't proactively look at each kid to ensure that they're free from any abuse, correct?
Most of those cases come to me.
Got it. Have you ever read Miranda to any students?
Yes, sir.
And you would say to them, you have the right to remain silent, correct?
Correct.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, correct?
Correct.
And you would want them to waive Miranda so that they can then speak with you, correct?
Correct.
And if they speak to you and say something incriminating, you intend to put that on a report and will be used against them, correct?
That's correct.
After you've read, how many times have you read Miranda to students over your 15-year career as an SRO?
I couldn't give you a definitive number.
Right, but a large number, correct?
Correct.
On any of those occasions, after reading Miranda, did you ever stop and say to the student, hold on. Don't answer that question because it could adversely affect you. It could affect your future. It could cause you to get arrested. Have you ever taken that role on?
Objection is to compound and counsel testifying.
It's sustained as the compound. Go ahead, sir. Ask your next question.
After reading Miranda, did you then ever tell a student why they shouldn't answer those questions?
I've never done that.
And obviously, the aim of these questions is to point out that a school resource officer may be a caregiver, but while he's there to protect the children from outside threats, he isn't always looking out necessarily for their best interests because he's investigating crimes, and if they've committed a crime, they could go to jail. I'm not sure that line of questioning did his client any good, but it was nonetheless interesting to see him juxtapose the abuse issue with what are you doing asking Miranda questions. And in this clip, what he does is he says, look, there's buildings all around. You hear a lot of echoes. He's again trying to make it sound more reasonable as to why Scott Peterson may have been confused about where the gunfire was coming from.
Have you ever heard the sound of gunfire outside?
I have.
In fact, your shooting range is outdoors, isn't it?
That's correct.
Are there any buildings in close proximity to the shooting range?
The shooting range is in an industrial park, so there's some large warehouses around the vicinity of the range.
Is it always possible to pinpoint the exact location of the origination of gunfire?
You'll hear a very large bang and an echo.
So you have echo on your range because there's buildings in the area, correct?
That's correct.
And what are your buildings made of?
Concrete.
What are the buildings made of on Marjorie Stoneman Douglas?
Concrete.
So you know firsthand that when you're shooting outdoors around concrete buildings, there could be a pronounced echo, correct?
That's correct.
And that could interfere with your ability to know precisely where the shots are coming from, correct?
Correct. It could interfere.
Do you remember Friday when you identified Scott's voice on some of the dispatch transmissions?
I did.
I'd like you to identify a few more, if that's okay.
Okay.
All right, with the state's help?
So up to this point, he has done a masterful job of creating confusion. One of the things that you never want to do as a cross-examiner is ask that one question too many. Now, however, we're going to go to that point where he does one thing too many. And that is, he's going to ask this officer if he can identify the voice on this radio transmission. You're going to have visual learners, right? People who are going to have to see it to understand what's going on. And you're going to have a subcomponent of people who are auditory, and they are going to perceive best what they hear, which is why it's very important that what you let the jurors hear is not what you're going to hear in this part of the cross-examination.
Keep the school locked down, gentlemen.
That's Scott Peterson.
That was Scott Peterson saying, let's get the school locked down, correct?
Correct.
Under the circumstances, thinking that there might have been people wandering around with guns or sniper fire, that would have been a prudent thing to order, correct?
Correct.
Did you hear what I heard? Because what I heard in Scott Peterson's voice, after he was identified as the speaker there, what I heard in Scott Peterson's voice was panic, pure panic, panic and fear. Now, as I've mentioned numerous times, I'm an old respiratory therapist. I worked in the hospitals, and I went through a lot of code blue situations. The code blues in the ER were always professionally done. The code blues in the intensive care unit and the cardiac care unit and the neonatal intensive care unit, those were always well managed. But when you would get out on like a medical surgical floor where they don't have a great deal of cardiac events, the thing that dominates the first 5 or 10 minutes of that code is fear and panic. Oh my goodness, I've got a life to save. I've never done this before. What do I do first? Okay, I know I've been trained and I know the ABCs, but where do I go? What do I do? And my job as a respiratory therapist was to stand at the head of the bed and first of all secure the airway. I would usually do an intubation. And then my second job was to say, okay, we've got the airway. Sally's over there getting the IV line. We need to get the drugs queued up. We have a doctor yet. And because a lot of times doctors weren't there, they had to run up to the floor where things were going on. And so instead of speaking in a panicked voice, right? Oh my God, we don't have a doctor. I would speak in a very calm, very monotone, very calm voice so that everybody else would be calmed by my calm. And in so doing, I could get people to think. I remember one code where they could not get an IV line started. A lot of times that happens when somebody arrests. And there is a workaround, at least for the epinephrine that needs to be given in a code situation like that. If you have the patient intubated, you can give the epinephrine down the endotracheal tube. It hits the lungs and goes right to the heart. So that's what I did. I said, if you can't get that in and we need to give epinephrine, let's give it down the endotracheal tube. And there were people there who had never heard that. And they're like, I don't know how to do that. So I disconnected the endotracheal tube and I injected it down the endotracheal tube, and we immediately got a little bit different electrical activity. And as a result of that, it was a real teaching experience for the people who had not been involved in it. And the reason I share that is because one of the things that you absolutely cannot do in a situation where lives are in jeopardy is panic. You just can't do that. If you panic, you are almost certain to make things worse, not better. And our cross-examiner here went one step too far by playing that recording because Scott Peterson's voice betrays his panic and his fear. Well, that's what I have for you today. Hopefully you found this interesting, beneficial, and if you would, I'd appreciate a like, and if you haven't already, I would appreciate it if you'd subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. If you have the opportunity today, go out of your way to do something nice for someone. Be kind in some way. It doesn't have to be anything big. It just has to be a random act of kindness. If we all do that every day, try to help somebody else out, even if just a little, it makes the world a better place. Thanks again for watching. Catch me down here at the beach next time. If you like this video, here are a few others you might try, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a terrific day, guys.